Welcome to our podcast today. Today, we're with Catherine and we're going to be speaking about mental health and wellness. Welcome to the podcast, Catherine.
Hi, James. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You know, Catherine, as we look at the organizational world, we're seeing quite a shift. And some of the shifts that I've seen are both, first of all, the recognition of the importance of mental health and wellness. It's certainly something that we can't visually see. If somebody has an injury, we might be able to see that externally if they have, let's say, a leg injury. But mental health and wellness is something that's more difficult to observe, at least for the untrained. And we've seen quite a push in trying to set the background to create better corporate organizational environments. For example, I recently visited the Sphere in Seattle, and it's a really interesting environment in which they have great workspaces where people can come together and communicate with nature and each other and have a much more open and inclusive environment. But that's a physical environment that's been created. There's a lot more to mental wellness. And I'm wondering, what is it that you're seeing out there in terms of the state of the art or where organizations are in recognizing the importance of mental wellness and importance of that to, let's say, creativity and innovation and the workplace itself?
I think there's a couple of things happening. I mean, there's companies who are definitely trying to recognize that it is an issue that a lot of people, and it's not just their workers, their employees that are dealing with, but just people in general. And that leadership, maybe it comes from the top because perhaps there's someone in like the C-suite who's suffering from mental health issues themselves. There are a lot of companies, however, that I'm still seeing, and I still talk to people, and having worked in a couple myself in the past, they detest the concept of that mental health wellness or wellness break from work. Like you say, people who have an injury, people who, have a baby, that's an accepted condition, that you're allowed off of work for those reasons. But when it comes to mental health, they see it as, you're not manning up, you're not trying hard enough, you're not managing your own well-being. So they put the responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the employee. And then they do tend to, and I've seen in the past, people have been, managed out of companies because their mental health isn't on point and they don't know what to do with it. And I think in the end, that's what it comes down to. They don't understand it, and what they don't understand, they fear.
Catherine, I would hope that some of those biases and perspectives are behind us now. And in the era that we're in now, there's a complete recognition of the entire package of physical, mental health and how that creates a much more creative, innovative, caring individual. And when I think of this, I think, well, there are some factors which are outside the control of the organization, things that people bring with them. They may have a stressful environment outside the organization, but inside the organization, there's a lot that should or could be done to create a better thing. There's organizational culture, there's compensation, motivation, leadership. There is particularly targeted health and mental health programs. How does organizations start to think of all of this as a big system? Everything from corporate culture and motivation, mental health. How do we picture that as a system that needs to be put together?
Right. I mean, a lot of the larger corporations do have like EAP, so employee assistance programs, where people can call in and get help. So I think that's a big part of it, because when people do start to call in, although their information isn't disclosed to the company, the company does get reporting on it. So just being willing to take that step and make that phone call and reach out for help sends back really important information to like the HR department and the leadership team that there are issues amongst their employees. So there's one. I think that there's we're seeing more and more that people are our companies are including like physiotherapy services in like their benefits packages. So I think that's also an important part, because there again, I believe that once people redeem those, a report gets sent back to the HR department, who can then see, okay, this is being used. If this is being used, it's because it's needed, and it is.
With that trend data that we see, Catherine, because if all this data is coming back, obviously HR can do some trend work. And is it possible, therefore, if we start to look at some of the metrics that HR is gathering, is it possible for organizations to separate the drivers or the causes of mental health problems within the organization from those outside the organization, and by identifying them and by looking at the trends over time, create better programs? What are we seeing in terms of using data to create a better environment?
I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that one. I don't know how much gets passed on. I suspect it's probably different for each company, each business. Certainly there are other factors like, they could do an in-house survey, for instance, and try and get some data back in that, could still be completely anonymous. I know that there's also other surveys like the Aon Hewitt survey that do kind of, they look at, how happy are the employees in general, right? So if companies have an environment where people feel comfortable sharing that with, even like an external firm, then there's the potential there definitely to be able to get back the information that they need. Aon Hewitt, focuses specifically on what's happening inside the company company engagement, employee engagement, and how satisfied people are in their jobs. And if they're seeing, for instance, an increase in the amount of psychotherapy that's being claimed through benefits, but they're also seeing that, their employees are engaged and happy and, feel comfortable and supported in their work, then that would indicate, I would think, that, maybe it's outside of the workplace. However, if there's a correlation there between, unhappy people in the workplace and the increase of, psychotherapy services, then I would say it's definitely something they need to look at.
Catherine, I imagine there's quite a dilemma that's undergoing in organizations. On one side, there's the need for privacy if somebody has a medical or mental health issue, and there's the natural privacy kind of envelope around that. But on the other side, as you alluded to, that if the organization is aware of this, it can take action. And I'm wondering what we're seeing out there in terms of how to thread that dilemma, how to walk that fine line between getting the information to people that can do something to help, yet at the same time maintaining the privacy that we all want to have. If the person doesn't want to share, then the organization, I imagine, the onus on them is to back off and let that person go alone. But that may not be in the best interest of that person and the others that they work for. So how do we thread that dilemma between privacy and providing the resources to help?
Privacy is hugely important, especially because, people who suffer from mental health don't want that stigma attached to them. It is still there. And they don't want to be known as the person who can't handle the stress, who can't handle their anxiety. But realistically, it gets to everybody. But sorry, to go back to your question, the privacy issue it is a very tough one. I think people are more and more being willing to stand up and say, hey, my leg isn't broken, but, some of the serotonin levels in my brain are, or perhaps like the firing of my neuroconnector, that like people are standing up more and more, and are willing to be counted. I've blogged many times about my own mental health issues because I think that we are stronger for someone standing up and saying, hey, there's no reason for me to be ashamed of this. It is just like having asthma. It is a chronic, condition that can be solved with medication, for instance. So, I think it's definitely, it should be up to the individual for sure. However, I think, as we move forward and see, and people are willing to put themselves out more and more, I think that stigma hopefully will go away and people will be more willing to talk about it. And then their companies can do more about it.
Is that where you're seeing the conversation taking place right now with just influencers or some individuals speaking about their mental health issues and others not? And then perhaps in the future it becomes more normalized and everyone feels quite comfortable with being able to speak about what it is that ails them. Is that where the conversation is going, or will it always be just a few lead users or a few lead influencers talking around the issues and everyone else being kind of the silent crowd that goes with them?
I don't think so, actually, because I think as especially in these last like 2 or 3 years, there have been some very difficult conversations globally, like the Me Too movement, racism is being, really looked at very carefully, the wage gap, for instance. So these are all conversations that were completely taboo even, 5, 10 years ago, but now we're talking about them so much more. And I honestly think that mental health is kind of trending the same way. People are, it is a conversation of, many, many small, quiet sentences that are being finally spoken aloud, even if they are quiet. And that has a culminating effect. And I think that, when the tide turns, companies are not going to be able to help but take action and recognize it for, merely the illness it is.
Well, Catherine, let's go back to the organizational work environment. Mm-hmm. And suppose we're the leader of an organization. How can we get a sense for how that mental health conversation and how the interaction is taking place and what inhibitors there might be for individuals in the organization? We can go to HR and maybe they can provide us with these metrics as to what benefits are being used. But it seems to me that those metrics are kind of cold. There must be a way of getting a more of a warm feel of what's happening in the organization. What do you advise leaders to do to get their own sense of what the mental health state of the organization is and how that impacts culture and organization? Is it as simple a matter as just walking around and talking to people, observing them visually? Is there other indicators that we can use, maybe productivity or the way people respond things? We saw in the old days, there used to be a management philosophy called, management by wandering around. And what can we gain from doing that for mental health?
I think in the past that was more about catching people not doing their jobs, which, to be fair, though, people who are suffering from mental health often do struggle with doing their jobs, right? They struggle, with the weight. They struggle when they have to take on extra work. They struggle when they have to, maybe even get on the phone. There's a lot of social anxiety that's involved with phones. So I think, having a good look for sure. But I think it takes a real compassionate person because, the last thing you need is, the dude with the MBA and driving the Lexus to come walking around and saying, hey, how are you feeling? Are you good? But on the other hand, if you had someone who was compassionate and he walked around and said, I've noticed that, you look very stressed. Like you can look at someone's eyes and you can tell in a New York minute, how stressed they are. And they need to be willing to hear that conversation and have that conversation and be involved in that conversation, right? Because, they can hear that, okay, this person is struggling, or perhaps this team is struggling. Metrics do tell a lot because the more comfortable, the more resilient a team is, the better they produce. And, it's hard to have resiliency when you're depressed, when you're anxious, when you're dealing with ridiculous levels of stress. I know that this is, a lot of people are going to be nodding their heads maybe when I say this, but, companies tend towards this idea of let's see if we can do less with more, or do more with less, sorry. They want to do more with less. So they want people to take on added burdens. They want their employees to work for two people. There's cutbacks in hours in retail locations. So it's not just corporate, wherever you are. It's also it's that street level, that front line worker is also dealing with it. And there's so many things that factor into it, such as just are we paying a living wage? Because if we want someone to come in and work for 10 hours and pay them a pittance, then of course they're going to go home and they're going to spend the entire time stressing about, well, can I afford to eat tonight? Okay, well, either I eat or my daughter eats, and we have to start treating people like human beings in the workplace more than we are currently. And we need to be able to look at the indicators and see, hey, these definitely point towards there's a problem, and now I need to go find out what it is, and I need to be willing to hear the answer.
So from the sounds of it, there are several different indicators that we could use, and the ones around interacting with others, that picking up of the body language or that use of the words that they may have, or just the way their activity seems to be. Is there resources for leaders to be able to do that? Because not all of us are really good at picking up body language, and we may be, as we're interacting with somebody, focusing on the conversation. We may be distracted by other priorities in our minds. So what do you suggest for leaders who want to be able to pick up the body language or get a sense of other individuals? How can they up their capability?
There are people out there doing that work. They are coming out to workplaces and say doing a mental health for salespeople course. Like I know a guy who does that. I know that there are mental health organizations where I live who run programs specifically targeted towards mental health in the workplace. I think it's St. John's Ambulance that runs actually a mental health first aid course that you can go do. It takes 2 days. It's like getting your first aid course that a lot of companies require you to have, right? So, you can go out and you can do that, and it gives you the tools to take back. One thing that we should point out though, like HR is not necessarily there for your mental health and well-being. It's there to like run the company human resources and the policies and maintain the policies. So like human resources might not be your best big place to start, but the EAP might be, whether you're an employee or whether you're the leadership in the company and you don't know where to start with this problem. Maybe start with the EAP because that is their job.
Well, there's quite a rising industry, health and safety, which has the safety aspect of it, but the health aspect of it as well. And I can see either as an adjunct to them or perhaps as a stream in the organization itself, focusing on the health and mental wellness of people within the organization. Are you seeing anything akin to the health and safety field coming about in organizations which focus on the mental health of the organization? And I like that example that you gave with the St. John's Ambulance, because physical injuries, that program has been around for many decades, and now to be able to get your certification, or at least your so-called first aid training in mental health and wellness, that seems like a really cool kind of dual certification to have. So what can we be seeing, or what are we seeing in organizations to bring that stream of mental health and wellness into the C-suite?
Right. Well, I'm pretty sure it's Sun Life actually. So one of the big, insurance firms, they actually have, and I've seen it on LinkedIn, for instance, right? So they have a whole kind of section dedicated towards mental health in the workplace. And I suspect it's probably because, as an insurance firm, they see the number of claims that come through for mental health crisis, and so they see that there's definitely something happening there, and they're trying to make an impact through their programming.
That's good that they're stepping up to this and they recognize the issue and they're trying to do something to change the game in the organizations. Mm-hmm. As we come to the end of our podcast, I'm wondering if you can give us a couple of takeaways that we can step up our game. I mean, we can't rely on the insurance companies to do it for us. Mm-hmm. What can we be doing within organizations to start moving this forward?
Just breaks are a big thing. Like I know, for instance, in retail, I know that once you get, especially like I was talking about the frontline workers, they often are like monitored and timed in and out. Giving a little leeway to get out and walk around the block, like that's a classic stress reduction tactic, right? So, but like you said, like we have these mental health and wellness, hazardous materials up in the break room. Why is there not also like what to do when you're having a panic attack? There can be literature that can be produced and handed out. There can be seminars, there can be lunchtime classes that they can run. Like even if it's a simple like yoga flow class that they run through lunchtime in the break room, that's a huge way of reducing stress, right? So, sometimes these little tweaks, they look for employee engagement, and that's the kind of stuff that actually matters to their employees, I think. So next steps would be incorporating some of those. I encourage any company that doesn't have like a mental health committee to start one. We oftentimes will see other committees like LGBTQIA, very important, a women's network, very important, but perhaps we also need to look at including like a mental health and wellness committee.
That's interesting, because what you're suggesting is both very, what I would maybe small steps, which are very visible to everyone, and then much larger organizational wide system steps, which can be done.
100%.
Okay, very cool. Well, Catherine, thanks for joining us today and talking about mental health and wellness.
Thank you, James. It was great to be here and talk.